I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap and close to the job site I had been assigned to for a week. It was late November, already cold, and I didn't want to drive back and forth every day. The listing showed a small house on the edge of a rural town. Nothing fancy, just a place to sleep. The photos looked normal. Plain furniture, clean floors, neutral walls. The reviews were short but positive. Quiet, private, good for solo travelers. That was enough for me. The house was about 20 minutes outside town, down a narrow road lined with bare trees and old fences. It was already dark when I arrived. My headlights caught patches of frost on the grass and the shine of wet leaves on the ground. The house sat back from the road, a single-story structure with a gravel driveway and no nearby neighbors that I could see. There was one porch light on, dim and yellow, buzzing faintly. Everything around it felt still, like the air itself wasn't moving. Inside, the place smelled faintly of cleaning spray mixed with something older, like dust that had been trapped for years. The floors were clean, but they creaked more than I expected. The living room had a couch, a small TV, and a coffee table with scratches all over it. The walls were bare except for a few generic prints of forests and lakes. Nothing personal. No photos. No books. It felt more like a staged house than someone's home. I walked through each room, checking doors and windows out of habit. The bedroom was at the end of a short hallway. The bed was neatly made, the sheets tucked tight. The bathroom was clean, almost too clean, like it hadn't been used in a while. The kitchen had basic dishes, a few pots, and an empty fridge that hummed loudly when I opened it. Everything worked. Nothing seemed wrong. The first night passed without much happening. I ate takeout, watched TV, and went to sleep early. I woke once in the middle of the night because I thought I heard something outside, but it could have been wind or an animal. The area was rural enough for that. I went back to sleep and didn't think much about it in the morning. The second day, I noticed small things. When I came back from work, the house felt different. Not dirty or damaged, just slightly off. The couch pillows were not in the same position I had left them. One was upright instead of flat. I told myself I probably moved it without thinking. I was tired. Long day. Easy explanation. That night, I heard a faint sound around midnight. It wasn't loud enough to identify clearly. It sounded like movement, maybe outside, maybe in the walls. The house was old. Old houses make noise. I lay still in bed, listening. The sound stopped after a few minutes. I checked the doors and windows the next morning. Everything was locked. On the third day, I found dirt on the kitchen floor. It was near the back door, a light scattering of dried mud. I clearly remembered wiping my shoes on the mat when I came in the night before. The mat itself was clean. The dirt looked like it had fallen off shoes that didn't belong to me. I cleaned it up and tried not to think about it. Later that evening, I noticed something that bothered me more. The hallway closet door was open. I hadn't opened it since arriving. Inside was a vacuum, some old coats, and a cardboard box on the floor. The box had been pushed slightly forward, like it had been moved recently. I stared at it longer than I should have. My stomach felt tight. I closed the door and told myself not to jump to conclusions. That night, I slept lightly. Every small sound pulled me awake. The refrigerator, the heater kicking on, the wind outside. At some point, I smelled something strange, like sweat mixed with damp fabric. It was faint, but it wasn't there before. I checked the house again, room by room. Nothing was out of place. The smell faded by morning. On the fourth day, I decided to check the exterior more carefully. I walked around the house in daylight. Near the back, I noticed footprints in the dirt leading from the tree line toward the house. They were old, but not too old. The ground had been dry for days. The prints stopped near a small basement window I hadn't paid attention to before. The window was partly hidden by bushes. I crouched down and saw that it was slightly open, just enough to fit fingers through. I closed it fully and made sure it latched. That night, I moved a chair in front of my bedroom door. I didn't feel good about it, but it made me feel slightly safer. I kept the lights on longer than usual. I didn't sleep much. Sometime before morning, I woke up to a sound that was definitely inside the house. It was soft, slow, like fabric brushing against wood. It came from the hallway. I stayed still, barely breathing. The sound moved closer, then stopped. Minutes passed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Eventually, the sound moved away again, toward the living room. I didn't hear anything after that. When daylight came, I found the chair I had placed in front of the door pushed slightly to the side. Not knocked over, just moved enough to open the door a few inches. The door itself was still closed. I stood there staring at it, my hands shaking. There was no explanation that made sense anymore. I packed my things immediately. I didn't shower. I didn't eat. As I carried my bag to the car, I noticed something else near the house. Behind the trash bins, partially hidden, was a flattened sleeping bag. It was dirty, worn, and smelled strongly of sweat. There were food wrappers nearby. Someone had been staying there. Close, watching. Before leaving, I checked the basement window again. It was open. I drove straight to town and reported the situation through the app. I didn't stay another minute. Later that day, I got a message saying the listing had been temporarily removed due to a safety issue. A few days after that, I saw a local news post online about a man arrested for breaking into vacant and rental properties in the area, living inside them while guests were away or asleep. I don't know if it was the same house. I don't know how long someone had been there before I arrived, or how close I came to something worse happening. What I do know is that the feeling I had in that house was real. Someone else was there with me the entire time, moving when I slept, staying just out of sight. I don't book remote places anymore. I don't ignore small signs. And I don't stay anywhere that feels staged and empty, because now I know that empty doesn't always mean unoccupied. I booked the place because it was cheap and empty on the calendar, and I needed somewhere quiet for a few days to finish some work. It was listed as a small detached studio behind a main house, somewhere outside a fading desert town. The photos showed clean white walls, a low bed, a tiny kitchen, and a long gravel driveway leading away from the road. Nothing fancy, nothing that looked risky. I had stayed in dozens of Airbnbs before, and most of them blurred together after a while. The drive out there already felt wrong, but not in a dramatic way. Just empty. The highway thinned into a two-lane road, then into something barely paved. The sun was still up, but the land felt dead. Old trailers leaned to one side, behind rusted fences. Dry weeds scratched the bottom of my car. I passed one gas station that looked closed even though the lights were on. After that, there was nothing. The driveway was long and narrow, cutting between two rows of tall dead bushes. The studio sat far back, separate from the main house, which looked dark and half-finished, like someone had stopped caring halfway through fixing it. I parked near the studio and stepped out. The air smelled like dust and old wood. No wind, no insects, no sound at all. The door unlocked easily. Inside, the place was colder than outside. The AC was already running, even though I hadn't touched the thermostat yet. I noticed that right away, but brushed it off. Maybe it was set remotely. The space was small but clean. One window, one bed, a desk, a kitchenette with mismatched plates, and a chipped sink. The bathroom was behind a thin door, narrow and tiled, with a shower that looked barely used. I dropped my bag and walked around, doing the usual checks. Locks worked, windows shut tight, no obvious damage. Everything smelled faintly like cleaning spray mixed with something older, like damp insulation. The walls felt thinner than I expected. I could press my palm against them and feel how hollow they were. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I barely slept, but that wasn't unusual for me in a new place. The AC kept turning on and off in short bursts. Every time it kicked on, there was a soft click from somewhere above the ceiling, not loud enough to be mechanical failure, just enough to notice. The second day, I settled into work. Hours passed without interruption. No cars, no people, no sounds from the main house. I realized at some point that the window faced directly toward the back of the main house, and the angle was strange. From inside, it felt like the window was placed too high, almost level with the roof line of the studio instead of centered on the wall. When I stood close, I could barely see out unless I tilted my head upward. That night, I noticed the first real problem. After showering, I reached for a towel and found it already damp. I hadn't used it yet. I stood there longer than I should have, holding it, trying to make sense of it. The bathroom had no windows, no vents. The air was dry. There was no reason for it to be wet. I used a different towel and left the damp one hanging. When I came back later, it was folded neatly on the shelf again. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I checked my bag. Everything was where I left it, but the zipper was half open. I knew I closed it. I always did. I started paying attention to small things after that. The position of the chair, the angle of the notebook on the desk, the way the trash bag sat in the bin. By afternoon, it was clear something was off. The chair was pulled out when I came back from a short walk. The notebook had a faint crease across the cover that hadn't been there before. The trash smelled stronger, like someone had added something to it. I didn't find footprints. The ground outside was too hard, but I did find a thin line of dust disturbed near the base of the wall behind the bed. I knelt down and saw a small metal panel, almost flush with the wall, painted the same color. It had no handle, no screws visible, just a faint seam. I didn't open it right away. I sat on the bed and stared at it, my heart thudding in a way that felt loud, even in the silence. My mind kept trying to explain it away. Electrical access, plumbing, something normal, but the placement made no sense. It was too low, too hidden. When I finally pushed against it, the panel shifted inward slightly, then stopped. It wasn't locked. It was held in place by pressure from the other side. I stepped back. The rest of the day passed in a blur of forced normal behavior. I packed some of my things without fully committing to leaving. I kept checking the window, even though nothing ever moved outside. As the sun dropped, the studio felt smaller. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. That night, I turned off the lights and lay on the bed, fully dressed. I didn't close my eyes. The AC clicked on. The ceiling made that same soft sound. Then, from behind the wall, there was movement. Not a scrape, not a knock, just a slow shift, like weight adjusting carefully. The panel behind the bed moved outward by a fraction of an inch. I stayed completely still. My body locked up. Every instinct screamed to get up, to run, but I didn't move. I watched the dark shape of the panel as it eased back into place. The movement was controlled, quiet, intentional. At some point before morning, I realized I was no longer alone in the space. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear footsteps, but the air felt disturbed, like someone else was breathing somewhere nearby. When the light finally came through the window, I got up and left everything behind except my phone and keys. I didn't check out properly. I didn't clean. I didn't look back at the main house. I got in the car and drove until my hands stopped shaking. I went to a police station in the next town over. I showed them the listing. I showed them photos I had taken of the panel, of the room, of the disturbed dust. I explained everything in writing. They went out later that day. They found a crawl space running between the studio walls and a tunnel connecting it to the main house. Inside, there were food wrappers, blankets, and a small camera mounted behind the vent above the bed. The AC clicks were from a manual switch installed inside the wall. The listing disappeared within hours. I stayed in a hotel that night. I slept with the lights on. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep in silence. Even now, I notice small things more than I should. The position of objects, the sound of walls settling, the feeling of being watched when nothing is there. That studio still exists somewhere out there, stripped and empty, looking harmless in photos. And I know that if I hadn't noticed the small details, if I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't have had the chance to leave on my own terms. I booked the Airbnb because it was the only place left within my budget that wasn't booked solid. I didn't care where it was exactly. I just needed somewhere to stay for a few nights while I handled paperwork related to a job transfer. The listing said it was a private basement apartment attached to a single-family home located in a quiet suburban area. The photos looked normal. Beige walls, old couch, small kitchen. Nothing fancy, nothing alarming. The reviews were decent but short, mostly one-liners posted months apart. I arrived just before sunset. The neighborhood looked tired. Not dangerous, just neglected. Lawns that hadn't been cut in weeks. A few houses with broken porch lights. The Airbnb house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac. The main house was 2 stories, gray siding, no decorations, no cars in the driveway. The basement entrance was around the back, down a narrow concrete path lined with overgrown bushes. The door opened with a keypad. Inside, the air felt stale, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. The lights flickered on slowly. The ceiling was low enough that I could almost touch it. The space felt narrower than the photo suggested. One small bedroom, a living area, and a kitchenette pressed against the wall. No windows, except one small horizontal one near the ceiling in the bedroom, half blocked by dirt outside. I dropped my bag and did a quick walkthrough. Everything looked clean, but in a rushed way, like someone had wiped surfaces but not actually lived there. The couch cushions were stiff. The bed was made too neatly. The smell was a mix of cleaner and something metallic. The first thing that stood out was the number of locks. The basement door had the keypad lock, a deadbolt, and a chain. The bedroom door also had a lock on the outside. That bothered me more than I expected. I told myself it was probably for storage before it became a rental. The first night passed without anything major happening, but I didn't sleep well. The house above creaked constantly. Footsteps moved from one side to the other, slow and steady, stopping for long stretches. I assumed it was the host walking around. Still, the timing fell off. The steps would pause directly above the bedroom, then continue. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a dull thump. Not loud, just heavy, like something being set down upstairs. After that, there was silence. No footsteps, no creaking, just the low hum of the fridge in the kitchenette. The next morning, I noticed the bedroom door was slightly open. I always closed it when I slept. I brushed it off and focused on my work. By mid-afternoon, I realized my phone signal was weaker than it should have been. The Wi-Fi worked, but slowly. Pages took longer to load. Messages lagged. That evening, when I went to take a shower, I noticed the bathroom vent was loose. The screws were still in place, but the cover wasn't flush against the ceiling. I reached up and pushed it back into place. It shifted easily, like it had been moved recently. Later that night, I heard movement again upstairs. This time it was different, slower, heavier. The footsteps stopped directly above the living area and stayed there for a long time. I sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening. My heart was pounding harder than it should have for something so normal. Then I heard a faint scraping sound coming from the wall behind the TV. It was quiet, almost unnoticeable, like fingernails brushing against drywall. I muted the TV and leaned forward. The sound stopped immediately. I sat there for a full minute, barely breathing, before the scraping started again, lower this time, closer to the floor. I stood up and turned on every light in the apartment. The scraping didn't come back, but I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the couch until morning, watching the clock change minute by minute. The third day, things started going missing. Small things. My charger cable wasn't where I left it. My shoes were turned the opposite direction. The trash can had items inside it that I hadn't thrown away, including an empty food wrapper from something I hadn't eaten. I checked the locks. Everything was still locked from the inside. That afternoon, I noticed a narrow door in the back of the bedroom closet that I hadn't paid attention to before. It blended into the wall, painted the same color. When I opened it, I expected storage space. Instead, there was a shallow crawl space. Bare dirt floor, exposed beams. It extended further than it should have, disappearing into darkness. I didn't go inside. That night, I heard breathing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just slow, steady breathing that didn't match my own. It seemed to come from the direction of the closet. I lay frozen on the bed, staring at the ceiling, counting seconds between breaths. At some point, I smelled something sour like sweat and damp clothes. The breathing stopped right as the house above creaked again. Footsteps moved toward the far end of the house. The breathing didn't come back. I packed my bag immediately. I didn't care what time it was. I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The backyard light clicked on as soon as I opened the door, even though no one had been outside before. I didn't look back. I walked fast, then ran to my car. I drove to a gas station and sat there for an hour, trying to calm down. Eventually, I contacted Airbnb support and reported everything. They escalated it quickly. 2 days later, I got an update. The city had inspected the property. They found unauthorized structural modifications. The crawl space connected directly to the main house. There were vents cut into the basement walls from the inside, hidden behind furniture. The host had access to the basement at all times without using the door. They also found that the basement wasn't legally approved as a rental unit. The listing was removed. The account was suspended. I stayed in a hotel for the rest of that week. I slept with the TV on and the bathroom light on. Even now, months later, I still check closets first when I enter a room. I still notice sounds inside, walls more than I should. That basement looked normal in photos. Clean, quiet, cheap, and that's what scares me the most. I booked the Airbnb late at night, half distracted, scrolling without really thinking. I had taken a last-minute contract job that required me to be in a small town for a week, and hotels in the area were either booked or priced way higher than I wanted to pay. The listing showed a standalone guest house near a lake, advertised as quiet, private, and perfect for people who wanted to be left alone. That part sold me. I didn't need luxury. I needed silence and sleep. The photos showed a small wooden structure behind a larger main house. The lake was visible in the background, gray and flat. The reviews were short and vague. Most of them said things like peaceful stay or nice place for a few nights. Nothing detailed. That should have bothered me, but I ignored it. I arrived just after dark. The road to the property was narrow and poorly lit. My headlights cut through tall trees on both sides, their branches leaning inward like they were closing the road behind me. There were no streetlights, no houses close together. When my GPS told me to turn onto a gravel road, I almost missed it. The driveway stretched longer than I expected. At the end, the main house sat dark and quiet, with no lights on inside. The guest house was farther back, closer to the lake. I parked near it and stepped out of the car. The air was cold and damp. The smell of water and wet leaves hung heavy. The guest house looked older up close. The wood siding was worn. The porch light turned on automatically when I stepped near it, which made me jump even though I knew it was just a sensor. The key was in a lockbox, like the listing said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air felt wrong immediately. Not dirty, just stale, like the place had been sealed up for too long. The lights worked, but they were dim and yellow. The ceiling was low. The furniture looked clean, but outdated. The couch sagged in the middle. The rug smelled faintly like mildew. I did a quick check of the locks. The front door locked fine. There was a back door facing the lake with a simple deadbolt. The windows were small and placed high on the walls, too high to see out of unless you stood on something. That bothered me more than it should have. The first night was uneventful, but I didn't sleep well. The guest house creaked constantly. I could hear the lake water moving, slow and steady. At one point, I woke up because I felt cold, even though the heater was on. When I checked the thermostat, it had been turned down. I told myself it was probably faulty. The next morning, I noticed small things that felt off. The trash can lid was open even though I remembered closing it. One of the kitchen drawers was pulled out slightly. I assumed I had done it without thinking. I left for work and came back after sunset. The porch light was on again. Inside, the air felt colder than outside. I noticed my backpack wasn't exactly where I'd left it. It was still on the chair, but the zipper was open. I stood there for a while, staring at it, tried to convince myself I was imagining it. That night, I heard footsteps outside. They weren't loud, just slow crunching on gravel. I froze on the couch and listened. The steps circled the guest house once, then stopped near the back door. I waited for the door handle to move. It didn't. After a long minute, the footsteps moved away toward the lake. I didn't look out the windows. They were too high, and I didn't want to make noise dragging a chair over. The next day, I tried to be rational. It was a rural area. Someone could have been walking near the water. The host lived on the property. It could have been them. Still, I started paying attention to everything. That afternoon, while sitting at the small desk, I noticed something above the bookshelf. A small black dot in the corner near the ceiling. It was barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I stood up and leaned closer. It wasn't a screw. It wasn't a nail. It was a lens. My stomach dropped. I scanned the room slowly. I found another one above the TV, hidden in the frame. Another one near the smoke detector. Each one was small, carefully placed, almost invisible unless you were close. The bathroom had one too, hidden behind a vent. I felt sick. I didn't destroy them. I didn't touch them. I packed my bag as quietly as I could. I didn't turn off lights. I didn't shower. I didn't check under the bed. I just wanted to leave. When I opened the front door, I saw fresh footprints in the dirt outside. They led from the direction of the main house straight to the guest house door. They were deep, recent, and stopped right in front of where I was standing. I got in my car and drove away without looking back. I stayed at a motel an hour away and reported the listing that same night. I sent photos of the cameras. I explained everything in detail. I also contacted local authorities. I didn't expect much, but I couldn't ignore it. 2 days later, I got a call from Airbnb support saying the listing had been suspended pending investigation. A week after that, I saw a local news article online. The headline mentioned an illegal rental near the lake. The article said authorities had found multiple hidden cameras inside the guest house, all connected to a private network inside the main house. They also found recordings saved going back years. Guests, private moments, everything. The owner had been arrested. The article mentioned additional charges after investigators found evidence that some guests had been watched in real time. I sat there staring at my phone, my hands shaking. I kept thinking about the thermostat being changed. The footsteps, the open zipper, the footprints. Someone had been there while I slept. I finished my contract early and went home. I threw away the clothes I wore there. I changed my habits. I check ceilings now. I check vents. I check corners. That Airbnb looked harmless online. Quiet, private, cheap. And that's the part that still gets to me. Because nothing about it looked dangerous. Nothing warned me. And if I hadn't noticed those tiny black dots, I might have stayed there the entire week, never knowing someone was watching every second I thought I was alone. I booked the Airbnb because I needed somewhere to disappear for a few days. Work had been piling up, my apartment was loud, and I hadn't slept properly in weeks. The listing showed a small A-frame cabin tucked into the hills, surrounded by trees, with no neighbors nearby. It was advertised as fully private, self-check-in, no host interaction needed. That sounded perfect. The price was low for the area, but not suspiciously low, just low enough to feel like a good deal. The drive there took longer than expected. Once I left the main road, the signal dropped to one bar, then none. The GPS froze, then recalculated on its own. The road narrowed into cracked asphalt and then into gravel. The trees grew thicker the farther I went, tall and close together, blocking most of the light even though it was still afternoon. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already sinking behind the hills. The cabin looked exactly like the photos, which immediately made me feel a little better. Dark wood exterior, steep roof, small porch, and a single window on each side. No other buildings in sight. No lights on anywhere else. Just trees and quiet. Too quiet. Even the wind felt muted. I unlocked the door using the keypad and stepped inside. The air smelled old, like wood and dust that had been sitting undisturbed for a long time. The place was clean, but not freshly cleaned. More like it had been wiped down days ago and then left untouched. The layout was simple. One room downstairs with a couch, a small table, a kitchenette, and a ladder leading up to a sleeping loft. A bathroom sat behind a narrow door near the back. I walked through slowly, checking everything. The windows were locked. The bathroom was stocked with towels. The bed in the loft was made tightly, the blanket tucked in too neatly. The ceiling up there felt low, and the walls angled inward sharply. I noticed the attic hatch above the loft, a square panel in the ceiling with a thin rope hanging down. That seemed strange, but I assumed it was for maintenance. The first night went fine. I cooked a simple meal, watched something on my phone, and went to sleep early. I woke up a few times to random cabin noises. Wood popping, something brushing against the outside wall. Probably branches or animals. I didn't think much of it. The next morning, I noticed the ladder had been moved slightly. It was still leaning against the loft, but at a different angle. I stared at it longer than I should have, trying to remember how I left it. I told myself I must have nudged it when I came down half asleep during the night. I spent the day working inside. No signal, no distractions, just quiet. Around late afternoon, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on gravel. I froze, listening. The steps stopped near the porch. I waited for a knock or the door handle to move. Nothing happened. After a minute, the footsteps walked away, circling the cabin once before fading into the trees. I assumed it was the host checking something. The listing mentioned the owner lived somewhere on the property, though it didn't specify where. I didn't like that detail anymore, but I pushed it aside. That night, I heard movement above me. It wasn't the roof creaking. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled gently across wood. It came from the direction of the attic hatch above the loft. I lay there staring into the darkness, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. I didn't get up. I didn't turn on the light. I stayed completely still until it stopped for good. The next morning, I checked the attic hatch. The rope was hanging lower than before. I was sure of it. I hadn't touched it. The panel also looked slightly crooked, like it hadn't been set back perfectly into place. I climbed the ladder and pushed the hatch open just enough to look inside. The attic was dark and cramped, filled with insulation and beams. Nothing moved. Nothing obvious stood out. But the air up there felt warmer than the rest of the cabin, and it smelled faintly like sweat. I closed the hatch and climbed down, my hands shaking. That afternoon, things started to feel wrong in a way I couldn't ignore. Items weren't where I left them. My shoes were lined up neatly by the door, even though I'd kicked them off carelessly. The trash bag felt heavier, like something had been added. The bathroom mirror had smudges on it that weren't there before. That night, I didn't sleep in the loft. I stayed on the couch downstairs with the lights on. Around 2 a.m., I heard the attic hatch move again. This time, it was unmistakable. A soft scrape, then the creak of wood-bearing weight. Something was up there. I watched the ladder without blinking. Minutes passed. Then the ladder shifted slightly, just enough to move its base across the floor by an inch. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The attic hatch was open wider now. I could see the dark gap above it. Nothing came down. Nothing made a sound. It felt like I was being tested, like something was waiting to see what I would do. I stayed awake until morning. At first light, I packed everything. I didn't eat. I didn't shower. I didn't check the attic again. As I stepped outside, I noticed footprints around the cabin. Not animal tracks. Boot prints. Multiple sets. They led into the trees behind the cabin and toward a faint path I hadn't noticed before. I followed the path just far enough to see where it went. About 50 yards into the woods, there was a second structure, barely visible between the trees. A shed or small cabin, weathered and dark. A thin cable ran from it through the trees toward my cabin. I didn't go any closer. I got in my car and drove until I had signal again. I reported everything immediately. I sent photos. I explained the attic, the footprints, the second structure. I also contacted local authorities. 2 days later, I was contacted for a statement. They had inspected the property. The attic connected to a crawl space that ran down the side of the cabin. The cable I saw was a power line feeding into that space. Inside, they found bedding, food containers, and personal items. Someone had been living there, entering the cabin through the attic hatch while guests slept. The host was arrested later that week. He owned the land and the hidden structure. He had been monitoring guests for months, sometimes longer, using cameras hidden in the attic and vents. The listing was removed permanently. I went home after that, but the feeling didn't leave. I stopped renting places that claimed to be fully private. I check ceilings now. I check ladders. I listen to houses at night more than I should. That cabin looked peaceful in the photos. Quiet, isolated, safe. What it really was a place designed for someone else to watch without being seen. And if I hadn't noticed the small details, I would have stayed there longer, sleeping under an open hatch, never knowing how close I was to someone waiting just above me in the dark. I booked the Airbnb because it was the only place available near the hospital on short notice. My mother had surgery scheduled early in the morning, and I didn't want to drive 3 hours back and forth every day. The listing was for a private upstairs apartment in an older house on the edge of a small town. The photos showed a narrow staircase, a simple bedroom, a bathroom, and a small sitting area with a TV. It looked dated but clean. The reviews were mostly positive, though none of them went into much detail. A few mentioned that the place was unique and very quiet. I arrived in the late afternoon. The house sat alone at the end of a street that looked half forgotten. Some homes were boarded up. Others had yards full of old furniture and rusted cars. This house was tall and narrow, painted a dull off-white, with peeling trim and a sagging porch. The downstairs windows were covered with thick curtains. I didn't see any cars parked outside. The check-in instructions said to use the side door and go straight upstairs. The side of the house had a narrow concrete walkway that ran along the wall, barely wide enough for one person. The door was old wood with a keypad lock that looked newer than the rest of the house. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The stairway was steep and narrow. The steps creaked loudly under my weight. The walls were close enough that my shoulders almost brushed them. At the top of the stairs was a small landing and a door leading into the Airbnb space. I locked it behind me and stood there for a moment listening. The upstairs apartment felt stuffy, like the air hadn't moved in a while. There were no windows in the sitting area, just one small window in the bedroom facing the backyard. The furniture was old but clean. The bed was neatly made. The bathroom looked recently scrubbed, though the grout was dark with age. One thing stood out immediately. There were vents everywhere. Not just normal heating vents, but small rectangular vents placed low on the walls, near the floor, and higher ones near the ceiling. Some were painted over. Some looked newer than others. I unpacked lightly and left most of my things in my bag. The floorboards creaked constantly, even when I stood still. I assumed it was just an old house settling. That evening, I left to get food and didn't come back until after dark. When I returned, the house looked the same. No lights on downstairs. No noise. I went up the stairs again, locked the door, and ate while watching TV. Around 11 p.m., I heard the first sound that made me uncomfortable. It was a dull thud from below, like something heavy being dropped. Then another one, farther away. After that, there were footsteps moving slowly across the downstairs ceiling directly under the bedroom. I tried to ignore it. Old houses make noise. People move around. I told myself the host must be downstairs. The footsteps stopped directly under the bed. They stayed there for a long time. I lay still, listening. The sound of breathing drifted up through the floor vents. Slow and controlled. Not loud, but steady enough that I couldn't pretend it was anything else. I held my breath without realizing it, afraid even the sound of breathing might be heard. Eventually, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I noticed the bedroom window was unlocked. I was certain I hadn't touched it. The latch felt loose, like it had been opened and closed carefully. I locked it again and placed a chair in front of it, even though it didn't make much sense. Later that day, I found something else. The bathroom trash had items in it that I hadn't thrown away. A paper towel with dark stains. A plastic wrapper from food I didn't recognize. I stood there staring at it, my chest tight, trying to understand how that was possible. That evening, when I came back from the hospital, the air upstairs felt different. Warmer, thicker. The smell had changed too. It now smelled faintly like sweat and metal. I checked the locks again. Still locked. Around midnight, the TV shut off by itself. The room went silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Then I heard something move inside the wall behind the couch. Not scratching, not scurrying. Slow movement, like someone shifting their weight carefully. I pressed my ear against the wall. The sound stopped immediately. A move away, my heart racing. I started noticing more details after that. The vents had scratches around the edges. Some of the screws were stripped. One of the vents in the bedroom was slightly bent inward, like it had been pushed. I didn't want to believe what I was thinking, but the evidence kept adding up. That night, I heard the stairs creak. Not the sound of someone going up or down, but the sound of someone standing on them, shifting their weight slowly, trying to be quiet. The sound stopped just below the upstairs door. I sat on the bed, holding my phone, watching the door handle. It didn't move. Minutes passed. Then I heard something else. The faint click of a vent cover being touched from the other side. I stood up slowly and backed away from the wall. My legs felt weak. The sound came again, closer this time, from the vent near the floor. A soft scrape, followed by a shallow breath. I grabbed my bag and shoved my things into it without caring how loud I was. I unlocked the door and stepped onto the landing. The stairway below was dark. I could smell someone down there. A strong, human smell. Sweat. Dirty clothes. I didn't go downstairs. I locked myself back inside and waited until morning, sitting on the floor with my back against the door. As soon as it was light out, I left. I didn't shower. I didn't eat. I didn't look around one last time. I went straight to my car and drove to the hospital parking lot, where I sat shaking for almost an hour. I reported everything to Airbnb and then to local authorities. I sent photos of the vents, the scratches, the trash. I wrote down every sound, every detail I could remember. 2 days later, I was contacted for a statement. The house had been inspected. They found a hidden passage system built between the walls of the house. It connected the downstairs rooms to the upstairs apartment through vents and removable panels. The host had been living in those spaces, entering the Airbnb unit at night while guests slept. They found bedding, food containers, and personal items inside the walls. They also found recordings from small cameras placed behind the vents. The host was arrested. The house was condemned. I stayed in a hotel for the rest of my time there. Even now, I can't sleep in places with old vents or thin walls. I listen for breathing that isn't mine. I notice every sound a building makes. That Airbnb looked normal in the photos. Old but harmless. Quiet but convenient. What scares me is how easy it was to miss the warning signs. How close I was to someone standing just inches away, hidden behind drywall, watching and waiting while I tried to sleep. I booked the Airbnb because it was close to the job site and cheaper than anything else nearby. I was scheduled to work night shifts for a week, and I didn't want to deal with long drives or noisy hotels. The listing described the place as a converted loft studio in an industrial area that had recently been redeveloped. The photos showed exposed brick, concrete floors, a high ceiling, and large windows with blinds pulled down. It looked modern, minimal, and quiet. The reviews were short and mostly focused on location and price. No red flags, nothing dramatic. I arrived just before sunset. The building used to be some kind of warehouse. You could tell by the size of it and the way the walls were patched in places. The parking lot was mostly empty. A few cars sat near the far end, covered in dust. The front entrance had a keypad, and inside was a long hallway with bare concrete floors and industrial lights that buzzed faintly overhead. My unit was on the second floor. The stairwell smelled like oil and old metal. Every step echoed. There were no decorations, no plants, no signs that people lived there long term. Just numbered doors and silence. When I reached my unit, I unlocked it and stepped inside. The space was colder than I expected. The air felt heavy, like it had been sitting still for a long time. The loft was one open room with a bathroom sectioned off by a sliding door. The bed sat against one wall, raised slightly on a platform. Underneath the platform was storage space covered by a thin wooden panel. A couch faced a mounted TV. A small kitchen area ran along the far wall. Everything looked clean, but again, in a surface-level way. The kind of clean that hides age. The concrete floor had hairline cracks. The brick wall had spots where the paint bubbled. The blinds over the windows were thick and tightly closed, screwed into place rather than hanging freely. The first night went by without anything obvious happening. I left for work, came back early in the morning, ate, and went to sleep. I woke up in the afternoon feeling stiff and uneasy, like I hadn't rested at all. The air felt warmer now, even though the thermostat hadn't changed. When I stood up, I noticed the wooden panel under the bed platform wasn't flush anymore. One corner stuck out slightly. I crouched down and pushed it back into place. It slid easily, like it had been moved recently. I assumed it was loose. That evening, when I came back from work again, the unit smelled different. A sour, almost sweet smell hung in the air, mixed with the scent of cleaning chemicals. I opened a window slightly, but the blind only lifted an inch before stopping, held by a metal bracket. That night, I heard movement. It came from beneath the bed. Not scratching, not tapping, just a slow shifting sound, like fabric dragging softly across concrete. I froze, listening. The sound stopped when I sat up. I stayed still for several minutes before lying back down. I didn't sleep after that. The next day, I started paying attention to small things. My shoes were lined up neatly near the door, even though I always kicked them off. The trash can felt heavier. The The bathroom mirror had faint streaks like someone had wiped it with cloth. The worst part was the feeling of air movement. Every now and then, a cool draft brushed past my ankles, coming from under the bed platform. I checked the vents. None of them were near the floor. That evening, before leaving for work, I lifted the wooden panel completely. Under the bed platform wasn't just storage. It was a crawl space. The concrete floor continued under the unit, sloping slightly downward. The space was taller than I expected, high enough for someone to crouch. I could see farther back than the length of the bed. It disappeared into darkness. There were footprints in the dust. Human footprints. They weren't old. The edges were sharp. Some overlapped, like someone had paced back and forth. I closed the panel and stood there breathing hard, trying to steady myself. I told myself it could be maintenance access, an old feature from when the building was a warehouse. That explanation didn't explain the footprints. That night, I didn't go to work. I stayed inside with the lights on. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Movement under the bed. Slow, careful. The wooden panel shifted slightly upward, then settled back down. I watched it move. Someone was underneath me. I backed away toward the bathroom, my heart pounding so hard it felt painful. The movement stopped. I stood there shaking, listening to my own breathing echo in the room. Minutes passed, then the panel slid open a few inches. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it toward the bed. The light caught the edge of the opening. I didn't see a face. I didn't see hands, but I saw fabric, dark clothing pressed close to the gap. The panel closed again, slowly. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I stood there until my legs felt numb. When the sun finally came up, I left. I didn't pack properly. I threw my bag together, left clothes behind, left food in the fridge, left the door unlocked. I walked out of the building without looking back. I went straight to the police station. Later that day, they searched the unit and the building. What they found made everything clear. The loft units had been built over an existing underground storage system. Some of the crawl spaces connected between units. In mine, someone had modified the access panel under the bed to open from inside the crawl space. They found bedding down there, food wrappers, bottles of water, a portable battery pack. Someone had been living under the unit, entering at night while guests slept, leaving before morning. Security footage from the hallway showed a maintenance badge being used to access the building late at night. The host was the building manager. The listing was removed. The building was evacuated. Charges were filed. I stayed in a hotel for the rest of that week. I slept with the lights on and the bed pulled away from the wall. Even now, I can't stay in places with raised platforms or hidden storage. I check under beds. I check floor panels. I listen for sounds that don't belong. That Airbnb looked modern and safe online. Clean lines, open space, good lighting. What it really was a place built on top of hiding spots, where someone learned how to live unseen, waiting quietly beneath strangers while they slept, close enough to hear every breath. I booked the Airbnb because it was close to the airport and cheap, and I only needed it for 2 nights. My flight had been delayed, then rerouted, and by the time I landed it was already dark. I didn't want to deal with driving far or paying hotel prices that tripled overnight. The listing described it as a private guest room with separate entrance in a quiet residential area. The photos showed a small room, a bed, a desk, and a bathroom. Nothing special. The reviews were mostly positive but short. A lot of people mentioned how quiet it was. The house was at the end of a long residential street with no streetlights. Most of the homes looked normal, but this one stood out because it was darker than the rest. No porch light, no lights inside, just a tall fence and a narrow side gate that led toward the back of the house. The check-in instructions said to use the side gate and enter through the back door. I parked on the street and dragged my suitcase across the uneven pavement. The neighborhood was silent. No TVs playing, no dogs barking, just the sound of my wheels scraping the road. The side gate creaked when I opened it. It led to a narrow concrete path running alongside the house. The walls felt close. I reached the back door and unlocked it with the code provided. Inside was a small hallway with one door at the end. That door led into the guest room. The room was colder than the rest of the house. The air felt heavy and stale, like it hadn't been changed in a long time. The bed sat against the far wall, the desk near the door, and the bathroom was tucked behind a thin partition. There were no windows. That immediately made me uncomfortable, but I told myself it was just a converted space. I locked the door and set my suitcase down. The walls were thin enough that I could hear faint sounds from the house, but nothing clear. Just low movement. The floor felt slightly uneven, like it dipped toward one corner of the room. The bathroom was clean, but the mirror was fogged when I first walked in, like someone had recently taken a hot shower. I stood there staring at it for a moment, tried to convince myself it was just humidity trapped in the room. I wiped it clean and went back out. That first night, I barely slept. Not because anything obvious happened, but because the room felt watched. Every small noise felt louder. The hum of the fridge somewhere in the house. The occasional creak of what's settling. I woke up multiple times, each time with the feeling that someone was standing just outside the door. At some point, I noticed the smell. A faint sour smell mixed with something metallic. It came and went, never strong enough to pinpoint. The next morning, I left early and spent the day out. When I came back that evening, the room felt different. Warmer, the air heavier. My suitcase was still where I left it, but the zipper was open. I knew I had closed it. I always did. I checked inside. Nothing was missing, but the clothes were shifted, like someone had rummaged through them. I locked the door again and pushed the desk in front of it, even though I knew that wouldn't stop anyone who really wanted to get in. That night, I heard breathing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't right next to me. It sounded like it was coming from inside the wall, behind the bed. Slow, steady breathing with long pauses in between. I sat up and listened. The sound stopped. I waited, heart pounding, until it started again, closer this time. I moved to the other side of the room and turned on every light. The breathing stopped immediately. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a thin vent near the floor behind the bed. Not a normal air vent. Smaller. The screws holding it in place were scratched, like they'd been removed and replaced multiple times. I reached down and touched it. It was warm. I didn't want to look behind it, but I felt like I had to. I unscrewed it slowly, my hands shaking. Behind the vent was a dark opening, just big enough for someone to press their face close to. I could see fabric inside, a blanket, a pillow. There was a crawl space inside the wall. I backed away immediately and grabbed my phone. I took pictures. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. As I stood there, I heard movement again. This time it was unmistakable. Something shifting inside the wall. Something reacting to me finding it. The vent opening darkened, like something moved closer to it. I grabbed my keys and my phone and ran out of the room without packing anything else. I didn't lock the door behind me. I didn't even close it fully. I ran down a narrow path, through the side gate, and straight to my car. I drove until I reached a gas station and sat there shaking for almost an hour. I contacted Airbnb immediately and sent them the photos. Then I contacted the police. Later that day, they inspected the house. What they found explained everything. The guest room had been built against an older part of the house that still had access to the wall cavities. Someone had widened them, creating hidden crawl spaces that connected multiple rooms. The host had been using those spaces to move through the house unnoticed. They found bedding, food, bottles of water, and personal items hidden inside the walls. They also found small holes drilled behind vents and outlets, positioned to look directly into the guest room. The host was arrested that same day. The Airbnb listing was taken down permanently. The house was condemned for illegal modifications. I stayed in a hotel for the rest of my trip, but I didn't sleep much. Even now, I can't stay in rooms without windows. I check vents. I listen to walls. I notice smells and temperature changes more than I should. That place looked harmless in photos. Just a cheap room near the airport. Somewhere to sleep for a night. What it really was a space built to hide someone close enough to hear every breath I took while I slept, separated from me by nothing more than drywall and silence. I booked the Airbnb because I needed somewhere cheap and quiet for a week. I had just started a remote contract job, and my apartment lease had ended earlier than expected. Hotels were too expensive for that long. I didn't want roommates. The listing showed a small, clean basement apartment attached to a larger house in a quiet suburban area. No shared spaces, private entrance, self-check-in. The pictures were simple but reassuring. White walls, basic furniture, a small kitchen, a narrow bathroom, and a bedroom with one window near the ceiling. The reviews were short but positive. Words like clean, peaceful, and good for working appeared more than once. The location was listed as about 30 minutes outside a mid-sized city. The exact address only appeared after I booked. When I drove there, the neighborhood felt older than I expected. The houses were close together, all built around the same time, with narrow driveways and tall hedges. It was late afternoon, cloudy, and quiet in a way that made every sound carry. I parked on the street because the driveway was already full with 2 vehicles. The entrance to the Airbnb was on the side of the house, down a short concrete stairway that led to a metal door. The code worked. The door opened into a small hallway that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals mixed with something damp. The space looked exactly like the photos, but the air felt heavy, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. I shrugged it off and brought my bags inside. The basement apartment was fully underground except for the bedroom window, which sat at ground level outside. A thick grate covered it from the outside. I noticed it right away because it blocked most of the light. Even during the day, the bedroom felt dim. I turned on every lamp and ceiling light. The bulbs were all warm yellow, not bright white, which made everything look slightly dull. I unpacked slowly, placing my clothes in the small dresser, setting up my laptop on the narrow desk against the wall. The Wi-Fi worked fine. The place was quiet. Too quiet, but I was used to city noise, so I told myself it was just unfamiliar. That first night, I slept badly. The mattress was softer than I liked, and the room felt warmer than the rest of the apartment. Around midnight, I woke up because I felt like something had changed in the room. Not a sound exactly, just a sense that the air was different. I lay still for a while, listening. The house above me creaked occasionally, which made sense. Old houses settle and shift. I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I noticed something small but strange. The bathroom trash can have been moved. I was sure I had left it tucked beside the sink, but now it was pulled out slightly, angled toward the toilet. I assumed I had nudged it without thinking. I threw it back under the sink and went about my day. Over the next few days, more little things fell off. The apartment always smelled faintly used when I came back, even though I was gone only a few hours. The smell was subtle, like warm fabric or human skin. Not sweat exactly, just lived in. I kept telling myself it was my own scent lingering in a small space. One evening, I noticed the bedroom window grate had fresh scratches on it. Thin lines in the metal, shiny like they were new. I pressed my face close to the glass and tried to see outside, but the angle only showed dirt, weeds, and the underside of a bush. I assumed an animal had tried to climb over it. Still, it bothered me enough that I checked the listing again. It said the neighborhood was safe and quiet. The first truly unsettling moment happened on the 4th night. I had worked late and gone to bed around 1 a.m. I woke up suddenly, fully alert, with my heart pounding. I had the strong feeling that someone was standing very close to me. I stayed perfectly still, staring at the dark outline of the ceiling. I listened for breathing, for movement, for anything that didn't belong. There was nothing. Absolute silence. I lay there for a long time, muscles tense, until my heart slowed down. I eventually told myself it was stress. New job, new place. Underground rooms can mess with your sense of space. I turned on my side and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, my laptop had been moved. I was certain of it. I always kept it centered on the desk, parallel to the edge. Now it sat crooked, pushed back toward the wall. The charger cord was wrapped differently too. Not unplugged, just rearranged. My stomach dropped when I saw it. I stood there for several minutes, tried to remember if I had moved it. I hadn't. I checked the door. Still locked. The deadbolt was in place. The windows were closed. Nothing looked forced or broken. I searched the apartment slowly, opening every cabinet, every closet. Everything looked normal. No hidden doors. No vents large enough for a person. The fear didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly like cold. That afternoon, I decided to leave for a few hours just to clear my head. When I returned, the smell was stronger. The bedroom felt warmer than before, like someone had been lying on the bed. The comforter was wrinkled in a way that didn't match how I had left it. The pillow indentation was wrong. It was deeper on the side I never slept on. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt my hand shake. I checked my phone. No missed notifications. No security alerts. I hadn't installed any cameras because the listing didn't mention them, and I hadn't thought I needed them. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the bed with the lights on until morning. Around 3 a.m., I heard a faint sound that didn't come from inside the apartment. It came from above, but not like footsteps. It sounded like something sliding slowly across the floor, stopping, then sliding again. Deliberate, controlled. At sunrise, I packed my things. I planned to leave early, but before I did, I noticed something behind the shelving unit in the storage area. One of the shelves didn't sit flush against the wall. When I pulled it slightly, the back panel flexed. Behind it was a narrow crawl space, barely wide enough for a person. The opening was hidden perfectly by the shelf. Inside, the air was stale and warm. The floor was covered in flattened cardboard and an old blanket. There were food wrappers, empty water bottles, and a phone charger plugged into an extension cord that ran deeper into the darkness. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I backed away slowly, grabbed my bags, and left the apartment without looking back. I locked the door from the outside, more out of habit than logic, and drove straight to a police station. I reported everything. The listing, the crawl space, the signs of someone living there without my knowledge. Days later, I learned the truth. The owner's adult son had been secretly living in the walls and crawl spaces of the house for months. He entered the basement apartment through hidden access points while guests were out or asleep. He was arrested without resistance. The Airbnb listing was taken down. The house was emptied. I stayed with a friend for a while after that. Even now, I can't sleep comfortably in rooms without windows I can fully see through. I always check behind furniture. I always notice smells. That week taught me something simple and permanent. Locks mean nothing if someone is already inside.